Thank you very much, Roger. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for coming back from the coffee break. I know it's difficult once you get down there and start meeting friends and colleagues and having earnest conversations. We will take you into the lunch break and send you right back to those conversations. So thank you for your attention this morning. Roger and I were commiserating, I guess, last evening about how long we had been in the industry and some of the joys and tribulations that we had. We did agree that by definition we were both quite old, having been in this industry for a very, very long time. I don't intend to give you any kind of history lesson this morning. All of you could tell the story as well or better than I could. What I do want to focus a little bit on is the opportunities that exist for all of us in the recycling industry going forward, and really the lay of the land today, because it is fundamentally different from where it has been for the last 5, 10, 15 years. And I think the good news is, for me, and I did breathe a fairly big sigh of relief, I can assure you that I had no collaboration with Gene or with Marcus prior to preparing comments for today. But listening to both of them this morning, I was relieved that we had a common sort of set of viewpoints, if you like, on what some of the issues are in the industry and what we can all do to be successful going forward. So we either all have the right answer or we all have the wrong answer, but one way or the other. I think you'll hear some common themes in my comments this morning, and there will be, I think, a good take on the industry at large in respect of some of the comments that were made earlier with respect to the circular economy and what all of the stakeholders need to do in the industry. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me today. 15 years, it's been 15 wonderful years of this conference, starting in Basel and then moving north a little bit to Hamburg for a while, and now settling into the home of the conference here in Salzburg. I know from speaking to colleagues over the years, it certainly is one of the most popular Escrap conferences in the world, partly because of the location, partly because of the quality of the organization and the venue, and certainly with the European Union having led the way on recycling for a long time, there's quite a bit of experience in the room anytime this gathering happens, and it certainly provides very productive conversations for anybody who's in the industry. So my thanks to the organizers for inviting us. All right, to paraphrase a famous English author, my 2 years in England, the past couple of years living in England did me some good. This is either the best of times or the worst of times, depending on your perspective for recycling. As we noted earlier, the weed generation exceeds 50 million tons a year today, maybe a few years from now, maybe it already happened a few years ago. That's a staggeringly big number when you think about it. 50 million tons of anything is an awful lot of material being generated and looking for a home, whether it's in a landfill, regretfully, or whether it's being recycled. It's a significant volume of material that needs to be managed. The downside, had we been here 2 years ago, we probably would have been fairly euphoric about the commodity markets and commodity prices. They were at all-time record highs, basically due to a fantastic boom and a growth cycle in China, which drove a tremendous amount of investment and production and consumption of most raw materials that we deal with in recycling. But today, we find ourselves in the complete opposite. There's been a huge drop-off in all commodity values for the materials that we recover. A fairly significant and steep one in a lot of cases. And it's impacted not just the traditional value-driven entities like copper and precious metals. Steel prices are at all-time record lows. We had a dialogue with the first speaker, with Marcus, about plastic and resin prices. Oil is now sub $30 a barrel, which is positive for a large part of the economy, and certainly from a consumer point of view, and certainly for consumer products companies that are using large amounts of plastic. It's driving their virgin resin prices down to historically low levels. But if you're recycling material that contains an awful lot of plastic, it's making it very, very difficult to generate any, if at all, positive revenue from that material. And interestingly enough, fresh from Davos this morning, the headlines are that all of the CEOs that are attending the World Economic Forum, only 27% of them see any sort of signs of positive growth in the next calendar year for their businesses. Last year it was 37% when they arrived, so it's a significant drop. Of course, they're always going to hedge their bets somewhat and be a bit cautious, but 27% of the attendees is a fairly low number of any of them expressing any optimism, for the short-term period from a growth point of view. The good news is, and we heard a lot about it with our previous speaker, the circular economy interest is growing in some jurisdictions by leaps and bounds, and I'll talk more about what that means to us from a recycler's point of view. But the combination of large volumes of material being generated and this very distinct and growing interest in the circular economy, I think provides some real opportunities for recyclers. Not in a traditional sense, as both Jean and Marcus referred to, but certainly from a growth perspective, we have some opportunities there. When I try and look at we recycling on a global basis, and as Roger mentioned, Sims is a global company from an e-recycling point of view. We operate in 15 countries around the world and basically span the globe from a geographic point of view. We try and sort of look at it in the sense of, well, it's a global issue clearly, but what we found is that there really isn't any sort of global consensus on what to do or what the problems are. The EU has clearly led the way for more than a decade now on driving collection and recycling and mandates to deal with it. The United States, the single largest economy in the world, unfortunately has a very, very dysfunctional patchwork of programs and rules. The total recycling level in the United States is stuck at 34% of basically all materials that are collected in the waste stream being recycled. Compare that to the UK, it's actually, my number's off one, it's 44% in the UK, and it's even higher in many EU countries. So you don't have any real support for recycling in the US, which is a shame because it being the largest economy in the world on its own, it could certainly do much better than it has historically. China has only recently begun to look at their domestic issues with the growth of their middle class. They are and will be generating massive quantities of e-waste domestically that they will need to deal with. And this, of course, doesn't even address the problem we've all discussed for years about imports into China of from developed countries. The African continent is largely devoid of any regulations. There's certainly interest in Africa in a number of countries, but from an infrastructure point of view, from a policy development point of view, and certainly from just simple boots on the ground, it doesn't have much in the way of legs yet throughout Africa. South America and most of Latin America is extremely well versed on regulations. They have all manner of policies and dictates, rules and regulations in many South American countries, but the actual amount of recycling that takes place is extremely modest. So it's a fantastic rule book, but not a lot of practical application for them. And most of the other developed countries are following some basic model of extended producer responsibility. It varies here and there, but places like Australia, New Zealand, certainly in Canada and other countries are on board in some manner. In addition to not having any consensus, I think it's safe to say, without getting too much of an argument, that no specific model has proven to be, the best solution for recycling. The EU regs tend to create a gap, in our opinion, between manufacturers and recyclers. The two entities that are responsible for paying the cost of recycling and actually performing the recycling are separated by a pretty substantial gap that has a lot to do with the framework of the regulations and the drivers that are in that regulation. So you've got a lot of controls, a lot of directives, a lot of regulation, but it's not really driven at bringing the two key stakeholders together in a productive way. In the United States, this patchwork of regulations that I referred to creates a massive amount of inconsistent product streams. On a state-by-state basis, different products are covered. You could be right next door between neighboring states, and you can collect products in one state that are covered by producer responsibility. 5 miles away, they're not covered. And so trying to run a business where you have competing schemes, competing regulations, and competing definitions of what's involved makes it very, very difficult. There's no real enforcement. There's no accountability at the end of the day. And as a result, there's very little incentive to recycle those products in an environmentally sound manner, regretfully. And in almost all cases, governments, when they're involved from a regulatory point of view, tend to tinker just enough with the models that they create conflict between the stakeholders, because there will always be something in the regulations that makes it difficult for stakeholders to operate in an economic fashion, or it may be difficult to operate from a regulatory point of view, and it may also create sort of what I might call artificial participants or extra hands in the soup, if you like, that simply take value out of the supply chain as a result of those regulations. We think that part of the reason for that is that the clarity is difficult when you're dealing with material that is both a waste and a valuable resource. If, a lot of ifs in this slide, but bear with me, if we designate any material as a waste, then it typically becomes well regulated in all aspects of collection, transport, and recycling. All manner of rules and regulations and certifications and audits and checks and everything else. All right, that's all well and good in terms of managing that waste. But if we want to recover the resources from that waste, by definition, those resources are now more expensive because of all the costs associated with managing them prior to and during the recovery. And you simply can't help but add extra cost into the product life cycle if you have very stringent regulations and conditions on how companies have to operate within that scheme. If we don't designate them as waste, which does happen particularly in the US and in other countries, then there isn't any incentive to collect and recycle them if the intrinsic value doesn't justify the cost of performing the service. So you can take it down to a very simple economic model. The value in the material is X dollars. If I can collect it, process it, and sell it for more than that, then I have a profitable business and I can continue. But when you have swings in commodity prices and you have other drivers in the cost equation that make it uneconomic for any entity to recycle it, if you haven't got any regulatory support for it in the first place, then the recycling and the collection will simply stop. And we have seen that in numerous occasions in the U.S. because of some of the flaws in the regulations. Some of the flaws are very simple. You know, they'll designate that a producer has to collect a certain amount of weight in a planned year. But as soon as the weight is collected, the manufacturers don't have a financial obligation to pay for the collection of any weight collected above that volume. Well, you can imagine that municipalities are trying to set up programs. They're collecting material from their residents on an ongoing basis. Recyclers are taking that material from the municipalities. And in the month of September, the funding stops for the program because the manufacturers have met their commitment, for that calendar year. Well, now you've got, material that is still being collected potentially, but it has no home because recyclers, without support of the manufacturers to help offset the recycling costs, they won't take it from the municipality. The municipality then turns around and shuts down their collection program, and suddenly you have residents that have nowhere to go with their e-scrap, and it ends up back in landfills or it gets exported out of the country. So the programs can be well-intentioned, but they don't necessarily really deal with all of the issues and satisfy all the stakeholder concerns. And in a lot of cases, and we did talk about this in the earlier presentations, in the recovered material cost will most likely exceed the virgin material cost. Now, clearly that depends an awful lot on what the raw material cost is for manufacturers of equipment. As Marcus indicated today, with oil prices at historic lows, plastic and resin prices for their procurement department are probably as low as they ever have been, and that makes it much more difficult to introduce recycled content into those products because the cost of bringing those recycled streams back to a manufacturer like Philips haven't really changed with the price of oil. There may have been a slight reduction in the collection cost because of fuel costs going down, but the amount of handling that a recycler or a collection agent has to do to get that material in the first place, take it apart, present it to a plastics recycler or present it back to a manufacturer like Philips haven't changed with the reduction in commodity prices. So you have a situation where everybody would like to support the use of recycled content, but it does, as any manufacturer will tell you, it has to be cost competitive with their virgin cost at the end of the day, and that's not always easy to do. It's also difficult to have consensus when all of the stakeholders have divergent views about what should be happening. So from a government entity point of view, whether they're a local council, maybe a county or a large province, or even a national government, they may be most interested in reducing waste and transferring the cost to other parties. So from a government point of view, their view is, well, we're not responsible for the cost of managing that waste. It's either a consumer cost or it's a manufacturer cost, and we want to see waste reduction. That's our mandate, that's our metric that we will measure, and so we're going to have regulations that will somehow, give us that mandate. The producers have an interest in the recovered materials and a growing interest in recovering those materials, but they're also saddled in a lot of jurisdictions with the cost of these extended producer responsibility programs. And those costs can be prohibitive. You can complain all you want about, well, manufacturers have to step up and do more, and I think that most manufacturers would like to be involved as much as they can in the program, but it is a cost to them, and in some cases it's an imposed cost, and somehow that has to be factored into their business model as well, because imposing a cost on them without giving them input into the solution is simply going to drive resistance from their point of view. Recyclers generally will profit when we have high commodity periods. I think if we all go back 3 or 4 years ago, most recyclers were quite happy with gold and silver and non-ferrous prices where they were, and I won't say it was easy, but certainly the burden of being profitable was much less than it was today. But by the same token, we sit here today and there are recyclers going out of business all over the world. It's extremely difficult to take in the same or a lower quality of material and see that the value of your output streams have dropped by 30, 40, 50, 80% in some cases from as little as 12 months ago. It's hard to budget and plan for that quick of a turnaround in the revenue streams for the businesses. Well, do we agree on anything? Well, we'd like to think so. I think most people would agree that the volumes of e-scrap are likely to continue growing, while in the short term, the material values will continue to drop. And I think they'll continue to drop for 2 reasons. One is most analysts and manufacturers and producers, metal folks and commodity folks, generally agree that there will be continued downward pressure on commodity prices for the next 12 to 24 months. We're in a very, very down cycle, if you like, from commodities. There will be a return at some point. I'm certainly not going to predict when, but consumption will return. Infrastructure will come back, both in developed and developing countries. There will be a demand again for steel and aluminum. Some of the capacity that's in the industry will be taken out. And we will see a bounce back in commodity prices, but it's not coming anytime soon. In addition, the amount of sort of valuable resource, and for most of us that usually means metal content of some kind, is decreasing in most of the products that we're seeing. It's decreasing for 2 reasons. One, as more material is handled in the reverse supply chain and in the collection network, a lot of it is scavenged before it ends up at the recycler. Anybody who who operates WE recycling plants in Europe knows that you don't see a lot of cords on SDA material coming back in. You don't necessarily see high-grade IT equipment showing up in compliance scheme material. All of the rich, if you like, product is scavenged out and taken out of the material before it arrives at the recycler. So we have less metal content, which is worth less. And I think there are some obvious exceptions. The mobile market is certainly a high-grade ore stream, if you like, for anybody in the recycling business. But it takes an awful lot of little tiny products to add up to any sort of significant volume from a weight point of view. And the other key point with the growth of material is that it's going to be fairly widely dispersed on a global basis. So it's hard to make an argument that there'll be a massive growth in WE products in Europe, for example. It's a very mature market. Obviously, it will continue to grow. But where you're going to see, 5, 10, 15% year-on-year growth in that 50 million ton number, it's going to be coming from developing countries, and it's going to be coming from other jurisdictions rather than growing in the traditional markets that we all might be doing business in today. So is there an opportunity for example, for WE processing in China in the future? Of course there is. They're going to generate substantially more WE material than they have historically, and they'll be processing it. But is that an opportunity for a company operating in the EU? Maybe, maybe not, but it's something we'll all have to consider. The circular economy thinking will continue to gain support. I think that's a given. You'll hear a lot more about it over the next day and a half. The waste issue, as I mentioned, will continue to impact all of the emerging economies because they'll be generating their own domestic e-scrap that will have to be dealt with. And right now, the current situation is not particularly pleasing for a lot of stakeholders. Everybody has some concern about what's not working, and I think collaboration is the key. Manufacturers continue to try and reduce their total WE cost because it's a drain on their business model. A lot of them are initiating circular economy programs because there's a lot of benefits to society for them to do that. Uh-oh. Did we lose the slide? We're good. Okay. Well, we're good up here. Okay. Local and national governments are struggling with resource allocation, whether it's adding surveillance or audits or enforcement or just trying to deal with programs as they might exist. It's hard. Recyclers currently are struggling for profitability, and they're looking for alternatives for their programs from traditional recycling. And to some extent, consumers are struggling with green fatigue. The effort on them to take back, to manage, to separate, and to recycle their materials. The agenda here makes it pretty clear, what these issues are and what speakers will be talking about. Circular economy has already been a big topic this morning. You'll hear a lot in the next day and a half about reuse and refurbishment because that's a new and growing sector that a lot of e-recycling companies are looking at and getting into. Standards, auditing, enforcement is still, we've been talking about it from day one and we'll still be talking about it. We'll have a separate session on materials and hazards and the consequences of trying to remove hazardous materials from products. Trade, again, is an ongoing issue about how to manage material and how to try and minimize the cost of dealing with a lot of WE product. And then technology solutions. What can we do better to make it more economic and to generate better quality streams of commodities so that it is easier for manufacturers to put it back in their product. Anybody's best intentions can have terrible consequences. This is not a picture of anywhere in China or Africa. This is in the United States of America and Utah, as a matter of fact. And it's become much more commonplace in the US now, as I mentioned, with that patchwork of rules that really don't work from a output point of view. An awful lot of abandoned e-scrap, primarily televisions and monitors, but there's no economic driver, there's no accountability, there's no incentive, and this is the net result. So, for years we showed photos of this in developing countries. Well, now it's quite a common, unfortunately, output in the US as well. So what do recyclers look at, from a new perspective, and what other activities and businesses can we get involved in to try and give us something else to hang on to? Well, I talked about two key areas, mobile products and data centers. The proliferation of mobile phones, of pads, iPads, Surface tablets, these are much richer in material content, easier to handle, and with the amount of product being produced and a higher turnover rate, there are certainly recycling opportunities there. Data centers, same sort of rule of thumb. As everybody moves to the cloud, the number of data centers being built and stuffed with servers is absolutely phenomenal. There was a study put out late last year that in the US they identified 1.3 million data centers in the country alone. I couldn't believe the number, but it came from the industry themselves. So you can imagine there's 1.3 million buildings in the US that are just full of servers. And those servers get recycled on a regular basis. Everybody needs more storage and faster response time. So there's definitely opportunities there. We will see tougher environmentally sound management conditions being put generally on material. There will be an expectation of higher recovery rates. We've already seen that in the WEEE regulations. I think you'll see a lot more closer to home solutions. Export opportunities will start to dwindle, partly because developing countries will have their own domestic e-scrap to deal with, and partly because companies will be operating on a closer to home solution when we look at the circular economy side of things. A lot of companies now demand electronic data transfer. That is, you've got to be somehow connected to them so they can see the material come to you. They can get access to the data once they've delivered to you. And it's the way they operate their business, and they're certainly dragging all of their recycling partners along with that. So if you're not seeing that already in your business, you certainly will in the very near future. And I think along with the circular economy, there'll be a much higher demand for sustainability credentials, and that is recycling companies will be forced to demonstrate that they have sustainability credentials, that they can benefit their partners, their manufacturing partners, by giving them access to that information. And that'll be a bit new for historical recyclers. Gene mentioned this earlier, Marcus mentioned it, it really is a key, and that is cooperation. If we continue to have adversarial relationships, we're only going to result in lower recoveries, lower efficiencies, higher costs for everybody, and less investments in all areas of the business. Well, how do we get away from that? It's a nice thing to say. I think service really will be the key. We have to be adding value in the supply chain in some way, and if you're only adding cost, then you're going to be squeezed out of that supply chain. Because as Philip's clearly pointed out, they're not viewing this solely in a do-good kind of scenario for the environment and their customers. This has to be a profitable exercise for them as well. So when they talk about owning assets, managing assets in the marketplace, and having service relationships for them, they're doing that because it's a profitable business for them. And in some respects, recyclers need to think about that business model a bit differently as well. Instead of just looking at product that you buy on a per-ton basis and try and squeeze a margin out of, you have to start thinking about what service am I providing, what customers am I providing it to, and how can I improve on that going forward. And that's my other point, that the recyclers will have to engage in new activities. It could be as simple as refurbishment, could be new material recoveries, but the old models on their own simply are not going to suffice going forward. There has to be something else going on in your business model in order for you to be successful. We can no longer rely solely on government solutions. That is, oh, well, they're going to put a regulation out there and that'll generate a lot of material and we'll all be happy because it'll be coming to us. Not going to work that way in the future. Recyclers certainly need to be involved in the government conversations to make sure that those regulations aren't punitive and make the business more difficult, but it's not going to be enough to basically create a business model out of thin air for you and allow you to be successful. And I think the last point I would like to make is that we really have to focus on shortening the supply chain. The more times this material gets touched, the less valuable it becomes for everybody. And producers that want to have a robust circular economy activity will expect that the partners in all of those loops will be very engaged in discussing solutions with them, in providing those solutions and being a full partner, not just providing one small sliver of that pie, because they need to have less, not more, partners in those circular economy loops in order to make it economic and efficient from a market point of view. So that's the short summary. Any and all suggestions are welcome, and maybe we can get to them, Roger, in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this great presentation. Steve is a real gentleman. He's not talking about how bright Sims is. He is telling us how the business works and what we should do and not do. So I like that very much. And it's amazing how managers see a dark future. I mean, it should be the job of the managers to make a bright future. So sometimes I wonder how they do business. But the business in Austria, and by the way also in Switzerland, where I come from, starts usually with a schnapps, you know. So you drink a schnapps and then things go smooth. And so we take one now. This is not the American way, I know, where cigars and schnapps is usually not welcome. But we go for that one.
It's going to be a long conversation.
Yeah, or a short one. Prost. Prost.
Thank you, Roger.
Strong one, huh? Okay. So we had a chat last night, and I have been told that he is working since 1984 in our business. And this is 32 years. So you're
just say it louder. It hurts every.
It hurts a little bit, huh? So what? How did you survive? You were always in the top management level. How did you survive in these 32 years? Things changed, and there were several takeovers. What's the key to have success?
Well, I think there isn't any real secret. I was very fortunate to be involved in an emerging market. Anybody that's been in Escrap, recycling, if you like, for any length of time, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's been an ever-growing and changing marketplace with virtually unlimited opportunities for both companies and for individuals that are employed in that industry. So every time we got into a new sector of the business, there was always something else coming, some other demand, some other opportunity, some way to either expand geographically or to expand the service offerings, or in a lot of cases simply to have more material being generated. So I don't think it was any grand design. It was more of just being in the right place at the right time, Roger.
Okay, good. You are looking like a movie star from Hollywood or a Californian server. How comes that you live as a Canadian hockey player? How comes that you live in California?
Well, we had a change. As Roger said, I was born and raised in Canada, went to school there, worked in the mining industry, which was at that time was very traditional in Canada. And the mining company, which was Norand at the time, actually got into the e-scrap business in the late 1980s. And it actually started in Silicon Valley in California, and of course at that time it was very high-grade scrap from circuit board manufacturers and such. And I don't think anybody had any idea that there would be that phenomenal growth and change in the industry over the years. But they went from mining underground to effectively mining above ground, and the business continued to grow and grow and grow for them and for all of the other mining and smelting companies around the world. So when you look around at the folks that are represented today, Glencore, Arubis, Boliden, the Japanese smelters, this is a huge part of their business model now, which didn't exist 30 years ago. And it's a way that they've taken advantage of the opportunities presented to them. And also it's an outgrowth of sustainability practices, and certainly from a mining point of view and trying to recover resources, much more efficient to get it, back from a finished good than to, find an ore body somewhere in the world and spend the money to develop it.
Mm-hmm. So is California still the hottest place in USA for recycling?
No, I think California certainly has a focus on sustainability and recycling that some of the other states don't have. The drawback in California, I don't think there's any regulators from California here, they tend to overregulate themselves. So while they have a strong focus on sustainability and recycling, they make it extremely difficult from a business point of view to operate an efficient facility. And even their best intentions, not that was related to the photo I showed, but they brought in a program about 7 years ago that mandated the recycling of CRT devices in the state of California, and they charged consumers. So it was an advanced recovery fee. When you bought a new television, you paid a fee that went to the state agency. Then they paid recyclers and collectors when the material was recycled. But they only covered display devices. So all of the other WE material that was collected had no home and no incentive, and it was all simply exported for years because there wasn't any incentive to keep it in California and recycle it responsibly. So, on one stretch you had regulators trying to do something good for the environment and for the industry, but at the same time they actually created a beast of export proportions, for the material that wasn't covered by those regulations.
Mm-hmm. So that's our message to the people from the authority which are in the room here. The regulations are way too complex, I think, and there are too many of them. And nobody is really enforcing the regulations, and that's a real hassle for all of us. And you told me that about, I think in the 50 US states, in all of the states you have different regulations about recycling. Huh? Mm-hmm. How can you handle this? I mean,
well, again, it's dysfunctional. 26 of the 50 states have different regulations. The others have none at all. So there's still a significant amount of landfill of e-scrap. There's still a significant amount of export, and there's quite a bit of recycling, but it's different in every jurisdiction because the rules and financial incentives are different in every state.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You work in the world largest scrap company. But of course, when we talk about scrap, it's ferrous and non-ferrous scrap. Mm-hmm. What is the portion of e-scrap at Sims?
It's about 15 to 20% of the total activity on a global basis.
On turnover or?
Turnover, tonnage obviously is not comparable, but on a turnover basis, it's about 15 to 20%.
And profitability, is it better or worse?
It depends, unfortunately. It just depends on the commodity prices and what's going on in the market in any given year. So it's not a consistent, always better, always worse. It unfortunately changes every year.
And what is the best market for Sims globally? Where is it?
On e-scrap or on scrap in general?
On e-scrap.
E-scrap, it's probably still here in the European Union, only because of the maturity of the industry itself. Certainly our biggest facilities, our most highly developed businesses are in our European bases. Sweden, Holland, Belgium, Germany is where we have the largest sites with the biggest volumes and the most sort of infrastructure in place. And that's simply a result of the time that we've spent in the industry and the support that it has received over the years here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How did your business change in the last years? 10 years ago, you probably just made recycling. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, people are going to do reuse. That means refurbishment. What is the portion of refurbishment activity at Sims versus recycling?
Well, to give you an example, 5 years ago, we probably had 0%, if you like, refurb or service, and today it's probably 20%, maybe even 25% and climbing of our global turnover. So it's gone from 0 to 20-25% of the business, and it's continuing to grow. And I think the interesting thing for us from a change point of view, that hasn't happened universally at every country that we're involved in. Some countries like the United States, we have to have more of a focus on service-related activities because there isn't the support for recycling there that you find in other jurisdictions. And in some places there's less focus on it. What's really interesting for us is that we go around all these conferences, and this one is no different. We now have companies that are only involved in resale and refurbishment attending WE conferences, which you would never even have contemplated years ago. I mean, so there's been an explosive growth in companies that are engaged in that end of the business, and a lot of companies are now doing both because we have to be able to provide that service model for our clients.
Okay. Is there any recycling left in the next 10 years? I mean, when refurbishment and reuse is going to grow, when is the top, the minimum of recycling achieved? When?
I don't think that a lot of the base recycling will go away. Certainly not in the near term, principally because collection rates are still increasing, and there's still a lot of old material out there that's very hard to repurpose again, into the market. What I think we'll see going forward is there'll be a much greater focus on recycling and capturing particular streams from products like Philips. I'm sure we'll hear from other OEMs over the next day and a half about projects they have to get material back from their own products and use it again specifically. So I think what recyclers will see is you'll still have volumes of generic material in bulk that you'll recycle and recover, but then you'll also have specific programs with your partners where you're refurbishing products, retooling products, pulling out parts for them, as well as doing, sort of your core recycling activity.
Okay. I would like to go to some very personal issues now for a quick moment, and afterwards we have the ceremony together with Steve. I remember, the actors in the old days, and the top managers and traders 10 or 20 years ago. They were, most of them were kind of old people, most of them were fat people. They drank a lot of whiskey all day long. They smoked cigars all day long. They showed how rich they are, how big balls they have and stuff like that. And now the new generation is different. So they are well educated, they are wise, they know what to do, they can read the numbers. And this is very promising for the future. I think that helps for our business. But definitely the old generation disappeared, and if you do not change, if you do not adapt to the new rules and education, we all will disappear from this business. I have questions about the prison. Have you already been in prison?
No.
No? Because it's really difficult for large recycling companies to be legal. There are so many different regulations all over the world. Transportation is a real pain to make legal transportation to some place, even if you have to notify something. And if something goes wrong in a company, it's always the boss who is responsible. So make sure that your people are going to do a good job. So this is very, very difficult. And I know you lived a couple of years in the UK, in the past year, I think. And but let me know, where is the best place to live and work globally?
Oh.
What do you like most?
I think, to give you an evasive answer, it's wherever you find the best opportunity, because you can always make a good showing of any place in the world. I certainly haven't suffered going from Canada to California to the UK, and it's always been with work-related opportunities to do that. And what I tell anybody who asks, if you have a chance to move or live in a different place, related to your work, it's always a good choice, because you develop relationships, you get perspective that you wouldn't otherwise have, and it allows you to make, I think, better decisions in the long run, simply because you're getting more input from a variety of sources than you ever would if you just stay in one place.
Okay. You are a world traveler and a 24-hour businessman. So you told me that you have 2 kids and one wife. And how comes that you are not divorced? I mean, when you work 24 hours.
Well, I think nowadays anybody, what we have found, and I'm sure everybody in the room can agree, everybody works more now than they ever did. It's not, I think in the old days, as you got older, you would see the work perhaps relax a bit, and then you put your years in, and then you could, coast is a harsh word, but you could relax a little bit. Now it's a complete opposite. You know, the more you stay in industry, the more stress there is, the more pressure, the higher the expectations are for people. And it's really about finding something that you enjoy doing, because if you enjoy doing it, then it's not a burden. If you don't like it, then it absolutely is a burden. But earlier you mentioned about new people coming into the business. I think it's a much easier sale for us nowadays when we talk about circular economy, and if we want to invite somebody to join Sims or a recycling company, you know, they look at it initially and go, oh, well, there's nothing sexy about it. It's not interesting. What are you guys doing? It's an old industrial, you know, base kind of industry. But if you bring young people in and you say, look, this is society benefits, this is closed loop recycling, this is circular economy, you're going to be working with manufacturers, with their environmental folks, with people that have an interest in making all these changes, then it's a much more attractive employment opportunity for young people.
So that was the invitation, that young people should work at Sims?
I think it's a great industry. I have a bias, obviously, but yeah, I think it has a lot more to offer for young graduates now potentially than it might have, you know, 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay, thank you. And the last question: who will be the next president in USA?
I have no opinion whatsoever on that, Roger.
Are you a Republican?
Ask me the day after the election.
Are you a Republican?
No, I'm a Canadian. I don't.
A very diplomatic answer. Thank you very much. So I would like to hand over the ceremony to Jean. Please, Jean, take over.
So we're now going to come to the presentation of our IERC Honorary Award. We've had some very prestigious recipients of the award in the past, from astronauts to solar plane designers, to our initiator, star creator of NBA polymers. We've had academics. And this year we will have Steve joining that impressive lineup of recipients. So you've heard an awful lot about Steve, I think, with the help of Roger. But just to recap on why Steve has been selected. Steve is at the forefront of the global electronics recycling industry through his oversight of growth and success of all of the Sims electronics recycling facilities globally. He has been directly involved with electronics recycling since 1991. I wasn't even working then. He has served on the board of numerous industry associations, participated as a stakeholder in all major cooperative Escrap policy groups, including the EPA Common Sense Initiative, the National Product Stewardship Initiative, and UN Basel Workgroup Standards Development. And he has spoken on the topic of e-scrap recycling at many conferences worldwide. Prior to joining Sims in May 2007, Steve was the president of Noranda Recycling, now Glencore, where he spent 24 years in various international metals and recycling capacities. He graduated from the University of Toronto with an engineering degree in mining and metallurgy. So Steve will receive the award today for his achievements, support and dedication of the e-recycling industry. With a career spanning more than a quarter of a century, working in markets around the globe, Steve has become a figurehead of an industry which historically managed waste, but is now known as resource recovery or urban mining. So if you want to just step forward, Steve. Oh my goodness, I finally get to lift the cowbell. Woo! So, Steve, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Ready? You can ring it.
Oh, just
One
both
more?
hold it?
Look at you. Okay.
Perfect.
So we're just going to ask everybody to stand. If you want to just maybe put it down for a moment, or we'll bring it with us, and maybe. And if I can ask everybody to stand for the Canadian national anthem, as Steve is Canadian.
You can sing.
Thank you, everybody. So, Steve,
Thank you.
congratulations
Thank you
again.
Thank you. It was lovely. Thank you.
And just to share the prestige of the cowbell, I don't know if anybody, we don't normally really say very much about the cowbell. It is a cowbell award, or the award is a cowbell, I should say. And really, the cows, the herd, are led by the cow that wears the cowbell. So it's really a sign of leadership, and so not to be recycled.
No. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.